Hello and welcome back to Philosophy and Humor. And this week we're going to wrap up our two-part series on humor at the limits of understanding. Last week we looked at part 1, of course, but this is a wrap-up, modules 12 and 13. This will be the end of our content for this whole term, and in particular the second half. I will come back next week with a one final video on the content of the exam, and the content again will reflect the second half of the course. So, as we typically do, we go through the content of the week prior, and we looked at a series of ideas, the most important one being that laughter is perhaps a natural expression to the limits of our understanding as human beings, the limits of our knowledge, the limits of our beliefs in certain things to be the way they are, and also to at times when meaning kind of escapes us, right? We seem to not be able to grasp reality in a complex and concrete way. Instead, we have to use language. And language is a kind of a symbolic system. It's not a real system of objects. Otherwise, I would drive around with a wheelbarrow full of stuff and I would just point and lift and go, here's a brick and here's a cat. We don't do that. We use words. And sometimes, even though society agrees that words mean a certain thing, there is some slippage, right? And language does constantly change. Language is an evolving, living organism, right? If we want to look at it that way. And sometimes the idea of truth becomes really difficult to pin down because we're trying to define something as true by simply using a symbolic system that in itself never gives us the final meaning, right? The final arbiter of truth, the final arbiter of understanding is simply just more words, right? Now, do we throw our hands up in grief and just, gnash our teeth and wallow and sob? No. What we do is what Jean-Luc Nancy asks us to do is to simply just laugh and just go, this is it. This is as far as we can go. This is as much as we know. That's really kind of what he's saying. So he calls this a transcendental laugh, right? It's a laugh that acknowledges our inability to grasp the truth that is going on around us because we're caught in this prison house, right? This prison house of language. And it can be a debilitating feeling or moment, but it could also be one that assigns us a degree of finality. This is as far as we can go right now. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to people accepting or rejecting that position, which is, we can't know everything, or we're not experts, there are other thinkers. Charles Baudelaire, who lived in the middle of the 19th century, died in 1867, if I remember correctly. He came up with an idea called satanic laughter. And so unlike transcendental laughter, this satanic laughter should sound a lot like what Plato had talked about in terms of his superiority theory. Baudelaire looks at it as inferiority, right? We are inferior creatures. We are creatures who think we have superiority over animals, over our mortality, over each other. And that is really satanic, right? We shouldn't be thinking this way because at the very least, it's hubris, right? It's pride. That's what that is. Now, other thinkers have come along since then, writing in the very tail end of the 19th century. Nietzsche had a similar idea that Jean-Luc Nancy, who was a still living philosopher, he talked about this idea of golden laughter. And this was this kind of transgressive force, very much like Bergson's élan vital, right? That vital force. And a golden laughter is a laughter that acknowledges an awareness that there is even an obstacle in the first place. Or once we overcome that obstacle, that maybe there isn't meaning lying on the other side. Maybe this is just an obstacle. Maybe this is just life. So the degree of self-awareness, the degree of self-consciousness that we have of ourselves, the greater we are likely to use that golden laughter and be aware of our limits. There are certain things we can overcome and certain things we cannot. Certain things that we can grasp and other things that we cannot. Regardless, though, it is still ultimately a laughter that comes down on the side of humanity, right? It's an affirmation of life. It's not an affirmation of the limits. It's an affirmation of where I am right now and how far those limits can be, right? We can create a whole lot in between. And so rather than bow down to this, this lack of meaning, lack of authority, instead, we feel joyous about it. We feel joyous because no matter what, we're still alive. And that is what mattered to Nietzsche, being alive in every sense of the word. Now, Simon Critchley, again, another living philosopher, he also looks at laughter in much the same way, that it is a kind of positive affirmation of our existence. The fact that we live, right? The fact that we are alive, the fact that we've survived things. We are going to survive this pandemic. We're already coming to grips with it by occasionally coming up with some pretty funny memes. And what we do is we acknowledge that we're kind of in the middle of this pandemic, but we're also capable of laughing. We haven't lost our humanity, right? There's some people that push it too far and go from that to, plus I want my freedom to do whatever I want. No, cool your jets there. An affirmation of our existence, absolutely. And even at the worst of times. But there is an understanding of ourselves and a self-consciousness of who we are in the universe. And that's not a bad thing, because laughter allows us to accept life as what it is. That's what a sense of humor is about, right? To rise above it, not sweat the small stuff, be very Buddhist about some of the obstacles that stand in our way, and really choose to struggle with the ones that matter, the ones that really mean something, that will make our lives better. Those are the struggles that are worth fighting for and fighting against. And then finally, the last person we looked at was Helmut Plessner, who says also, just like the others, Nancy, Baudelaire, Nietzsche, and Critchley, Plessner says that laughter lies at the core of the human experience. It is who we are. But what he says is rather interesting, because he says when we laugh, just like when we cry or we sob, a distinction between what the mind thinks and what the body can express really kind of collapse into one. And we become literally one state of mind. The body expresses in a very physical and outward manner what the mind is thinking. So what the state of mind is that we have is expressed through our bodies. And we've kind of talked about this before. Much earlier in the course, we talked about his humor and emotion. We talked about the distinction between humor and laughter. Humor is a kind of worldview. It's a sense of our place in the world, while laughter is something that is a physiological response that doesn't necessarily have to come from humor. We can be nervous, anxious. We could be, we're being tickled by someone. So we physiologically respond to a state of affairs by laughing. And Plessner just kind of confirms that. And he says, when we laugh, just like when we cry, what our mind is thinking or feeling is what our body expresses. There's no disjunction. There's no disconnect between the two. It's a what we can call a pure moment. It's a pure moment in which the body expresses what the mind is thinking. Okay, so this is now the last part, the second half of Humor at the Limits of Understanding. And the book that I used is this little one here, Humour, A Very Short Introduction. Not very big, right? It's about 120 pages, not including the index at the end. But boy, is it packed with a lot of cool stuff. It's from a short, the very short introduction. This is another one called Comedy. I also used a few things from it throughout the course. But I want to take a look at Noel Carroll's book, Humour, A Very Short Introduction. It came out in 2014, because many of the ideas that I present here today come from this book. Now, we have been talking and thinking about this very idea literally all through the course, that humor needs to be considered in terms of the role that it plays in social life. As a social lubricant, breaking the ice at parties, showing to others who we really are, what we consider to be funny. But what it's also doing, and this is kind of the avenue we're going to travel down now today, is that humor plays with the norms that we abide by, right? The norms that govern the society that we live in. And what humor does is it calls attention to these norms, in certain cases, perhaps for the first time. A lot of things that we do kind of instinctively, naturally, we don't really think about it. And yet a lot of these things have been learned processes. When you're very young, let's say you're, on the bus with your mom and somebody doesn't smell very nice, and you kind of, look at your mother and look at the person and go, that man stinks, right? Whoops. Okay. No filter. So your mother tells you, like, you shouldn't say that about people. That's kind of not very nice. And you are told that enough times that eventually you just naturally do it. And this is when culture becomes acculturation. And acculturation is when we internalize these norms, prescriptive forms of behavior, expectations, all the things that we have talked about previously, especially in humor and ethics, which is kind of another part of today's lesson. Humor deals with these norms and expectations that we have built into society. And then by making fun of them, they're actually reinforcing them. Because think about it. If you're laughing at someone doing something really stupid, you're doing two things, right? There's two halves of your brain going. You got the one half going, right, I recognize what should have been done instead, or what should have been said or not said instead, versus what I'm seeing. So what you're seeing, you're laughing at. But it's also in a strange way reinforcing that expected behavior, because you're able to reconcile both of those things in your head. So that is essentially kind of the main focus of today's lesson. This idea that humor can work sometimes as a corrective. Now, who else said that, right? Two people. Plato, remember, said way back at the beginning in the course, he said, I am not a fan of humor because it's very malicious and it focuses on our base instincts. But, big qualifier here, I will accept it in the form of education and pedagogical thinking. And so here's kind of the same sort of thing, right? It works as a kind of corrective that allows people to think about the way they act and talk and think as well, so that perhaps they won't be the butt of a joke next time. So it is this moment where culture and society kind of reproduces itself in the form of a joke, because it points out something that is really silly and unacceptable. I mean, again, it's mildly unacceptable. It's humorous. It's not somebody randomly walking out in the street with a gun. That's a whole other thing. But humor is one of these weird, strange, wonderful human ways in which culture reproduces itself. It repeats itself. Hey, remember this? Don't say nasty things to people, in front of them, especially in a confined area, or talk about things that that people can't change, because that's just plain rude. That's all there is to it. So humor is one of these moments where culture can reproduce itself, and those social norms, right? Those expectations that our culture or our society considers to be important. Because if it didn't, it wouldn't be also right for humor. So what's happening here when we are doing this is we're doing something that Noel Carroll calls shared presuppositions. So in order for something to be funny, we need to be able to share in that presupposition. In other words, we need to be able to share in what was expected. We need to share and recognize what should have been. In other words, what regarding correct or appropriate norms, that's what we're laughing at. We recognize and share together the fact that, no, you shouldn't say, rude things to people. Maybe little kids can get away with it, but adults should know better. That's the shared presupposition. So when we are laughing, we're sharing temporarily we are recognizing and then sharing. Let me be clear. So we're recognizing and then sharing these concepts. Again, sometimes for the first time. Imagine people that come from somewhere else, like another part of the world, and move to Canada or move to London specifically, and have to acculturate themselves very quickly as adults to the way things are done, the way people behave. It's one thing to learn the language, but it's a whole other thing to internalize all these shared presuppositions that a particular society has as to what it considers to be proper behavior. So when we laugh together, we acknowledge our membership in a community and we recognize those shared concepts. So this is a clip from The Office. This is the Steve Carell version, not the Ricky Gervais one. And this section is called sensitivity training. So here we have a group, a community. These are people that work with one another, basically calling out their boss, right, for saying and doing things which are obnoxious and inappropriate, and how he kind of responds to it. So the crew, right, the office people, are quite clear on what is proper etiquette, proper decorum and norms. The boss, not so much. So have a look at it, and we'll see you back in just a few minutes. Okay, so when we are doing this and we are sharing these presuppositions, we're also doing something else. And this is kind of where it gets a little bit more dicey. Because what humor is doing is it's creating an us and them. Now, the us, of course, ourselves, we're right thinking, we use common sense, we're intelligent, we know better. But guess what? An us, I should say, can't exist by itself. It has to exist in and through the other or them, right? So there's always an us and them, because we cannot exist as a group unless we define ourselves over and against another group. Now, it's how we define that other group that tells us whether we are ethical or moral, or on the opposite, racist or sexist or homophobic or anything else like that. So this is where humor kind of gets on that, and I don't want to say slippery slope, but on that kind of shaky ground. So how and why we define a them as a subject of humor says a lot about who we are. Okay, so the first thing we need to be aware of is, for humor to work well, we need to be socially, intellectually aware that an error has even been made in the first place. So think of someone who has just emigrated to Canada and used to do things a certain way. And in London, Ontario, well, we don't do these things. We don't speak this way. We don't, air our dirty laundry, quote unquote. And the person that is doing it just may not know, right? They just may not be aware. They haven't acculturated themselves to that degree yet. So when we are defining ourselves as us and them, how we define the them in relation to us says a lot about who we are and our morality. So we have to be aware that a mistake has been made in the first place. That's what makes us right thinking and, full of common sense and all the rest of it. So we have a moral standard, or a kind of measuring stick, in which we can measure that comic deviation. Now we're kind of back to Aristotle. Remember that, a slight deviation is funny, too far, it becomes horrific and anxiety inducing. So that comic deviation, whether it's, through logic, morality, or etiquette, or any of these things, if it's kind of almost insignificant but slight, typically it's worthy of laughter. If it's an extreme form of behavior that is, deviating from reason and logic, we're onto something else. But the bottom line to all of this is that we ourselves, as us, we have to be aware of what is going on in the first place. And what we're talking about is what should be going on. So for humor to work successfully, it must be socially and intellectually, we must be aware that an error has been made, right? Because we're the ones that have that moral standard. We are the us that say, well, you should be doing things this way. Now, we should be making fun of things that we can correct, right? Because there is that pedagogical aspect to humor, that educational aspect to humor that allows people to kind of point out something that another person that is doing that is silly or uncalled for or just mildly incorrect. And so by doing that, they can learn from it. And if all goes well, they can laugh with you. Like, okay, I didn't realize. And they've learned. And they've acculturated themselves just a little bit. But we are the ones that possess that moral standard by which we measure that deviation. This is the clip from The Daily Show. This is pre-pandemic times. So Trevor Noah is able to sit behind a desk and have an audience that laughs. Back, remember the good old days about 800 years ago? Feels that way. So The Daily Show, this was a response that Trevor Noah had to a racist ad. And you'll see part of the ad, and he'll kind of contextualize it for you. But listen carefully to how he identifies that deviation from the community standard, the moral standard, and then kind of goes a little bit further and asks questions as to perhaps why a company would want to even do that in the first place. Is it to get PR? This idea that even bad publicity is still publicity. How far do you want to take that? So have a look at The Daily Show, How to Make a Racist Ad, and I'll see you back in a moment. So the one thing we need to remember, though, is that humor itself is not the source of social and cultural norms. These come from elsewhere. There are also other ways in which we can learn, these social and cultural norms. They used to be, believe it or not, I think by the early 70s, they were gone. But there used to be classes in school called civics. And civics, the word civil is kind of buried in there. And it was all about civil behavior, about debating and discussing an idea with someone in a reasonable manner, and not shouting and screaming at each other and threatening to pull a gun or punch them out or whatever, because that's not civics. That's quite the opposite. But civics used to be the vehicle by which people would learn these social and cultural norms, what to do, what not to do. But what humor does is it reinforces them, doesn't create them, but it reinforces them by pointing out the deviation from what should be. And again, if it's slight, it's humorous. If it's extreme, then it could be horrifying. So when we're laughing at something, we're laughing at these pre-existing norms that define essentially who we are, right? It defines our community. So humor reinforces social norms, points out comic deviations from them. And when we laugh, right, we're laughing at these pre-existing norms that define who we are and our community and our place in that community. So this is Samuel J. Comroe. Comroe, I believe is correct way to pronounce it. And he is an individual who suffers from Tourette's. So Tourette syndrome is something he suffers from, but he is able to use that as comedic material. And what he's doing, just like some of the other comedians that I've asked you to watch, especially when we were talking about issues of racism, and sort of humor and ethics and so on, the same kind of thing is going on. So what Comroe is doing is playing with the expectations, right? These pre-existing norms that we have as to how people with Tourette's typically behave. So what he does is he plays with it. He makes us laugh at it, but listen carefully. He's reinforcing not only the preconceptions. Now, at this point, it's bordering on stereotype, and then his particular experience. So have a look at that, and we'll see you back in just a moment. Okay. Humor, as you can imagine, and we've talked about this numerous times, humor does sort of run parallel with ethics because the two of them are, they kind of are codependent. They interact with one another. And certainly it won't be the first time we've also said that, humor is about ridicule. It's about malice, those feelings of superiority. Some of you have argued in your essays that you believe that really there isn't a whole lot of humor that doesn't have that degree of superiority. I would say generally yes, but there are new forms of absurdist humor, for example, that really try to break that mold, right? To kind of subvert it and undercut it. But yes, there are a lot of types of humor that really can fall into that general category of superiority theory. So the more pernicious and more malicious kinds of humor, look at infirmity and stupidity, extreme transgressions of these different norms. And sometimes they're just intentionally nasty. Some people can just tell nasty jokes because they can, right? Because they can, and especially because they know they're going to get a rise out of somebody. When you know that if you tell a joke, mixed company or otherwise, and you're going to get people groaning and sometimes people say it on purpose because they just like to make people uncomfortable. Don't know why, but humor and ethics are correlated in very significant ways, just like I've just pointed out. The ridicule, the malice, the superiority, the transgressive nature of some types of humor, because really, humor revels in all kinds of vice and absurdity and, incongruous behavior and irrationality and so on. And it did kind of reach, depending on who you are, a high point or a low point in the late 80s and very early 90s. I don't know if any of you can recognize or do recognize this individual, Andrew Dice Clay. I haven't put any of his stuff up there. If you want to find out what I mean, you can certainly Google Andrew Dice Clay, and you can go on YouTube. There's lots of his clips. And yeah, his stuff is really crass, and it's intentionally crass. And so here we start having some problems as to what can a comedian get away with. Some of you feel very strongly that there should be no limits. Others feel differently. And right now, that's kind of where this conversation is going, because now we're talking about humor and ethics, humor and morality. Now, do we become an apologist and say, they're only kidding? Humor is not morally right or wrong. It's beyond good and evil. They're just words. Well, it's true, but we still have to ask ourselves, who is saying it, in what context, and for what reason, right? If you can answer that question without any sense of malice, it's probably okay. But Andrew Dice Clay, probably one of the reasons why you don't really know of him, because he came and went, I would say probably within a couple of years, 3 years at the most. He rose very quickly, ended up playing Madison Square Gardens and selling out. But literally within 3 years, he couldn't have sold 20 seats. Why? Because all of a sudden it became clear to society, North American society, that shock humor wore off really quickly. It's a shock the first time, but the 15th or 20th time, it's no longer funny. It's kind of uncomfortable and just crass. When you hear something for the first time, yes, the shock value is there. It's called the shock of the new. And along comes Andrew Dice Clay, Two Live Crew. There were a couple of other comedians. And they were shocking people because they were saying things that had never been said before, kind of in public. But you can't keep doing that unless you are willing and ready to push the envelope further and further in this kind of dialectic of outrage, or you keep repeating yourself because, hey, it's what's gotten you money so far. Well, you do that, and your shtick, your thing wears out really quickly. So what I'm saying here is, the fact that humor may be beyond good and evil, it's not, morally right or wrong, but it still matters who's saying it. Okay, so if that is the case, and I'm asking you to consider who's speaking, in what context and for what reason, now we're talking about not only language, but we're talking about speaking subjects and listening subjects. So when we have individuals that are talking to other individuals about, let's say, a third party, now we're getting back into the us and them kind of thing. The comedian and the privileged audience will say, let's say the white audience, let's go for race, the white audience and the white comedian, cracking jokes about other ethnic groups. Yeah, that us and them is very clear, but it's also pretty pernicious, because here's the problem. If that's the case, right, is it the case when ethnic minorities and disempowered individuals, when they become the butt of a joke, does this still work? If you are reproducing the very system that is holding these people down, or creating stereotypes about them, then the humor isn't really, it's not immoral, it's not innocent, it's perpetuating a stereotype. And when that happens, you've got a different series of problems to deal with. So if you are dealing with these types of jokes and the negative stereotypes that are associated with it, we're kind of laughing at a group of people that have been up to this point disenfranchised, disempowered, basically mistreated in one way or another. So when people, visible minorities and disenfranchised individuals are the comic butt of a joke, is that joke still, beyond morality and beyond good and evil? So let's turn the tables and say, hey, what if the jokes were made about white people or lawyers? And this is what I have here from, this is from Better Call Saul. I apologize with the sound. For some reason, it looked like it was shot off a TV. The clip works. It's only about a minute and a half, roughly. And there are literally, there are 8 lawyer jokes within 2 minutes. But again, I apologize for the sound. Have a listen to it. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about this idea of jokes about lawyers or white people or rich people versus others. So enjoy it, and I'll see you back in a moment. Okay, here's the difference. The difference between jokes about lawyers and wealthy people and jokes about minorities is really about the power structure and the privilege and the entitlement that certain individuals have in that society and others do not. So when a joke is trading not in social norms, well, see, they are. And here's the problem, right? The social norm is inequality. The social norm is prejudice, right? Those are the social norms that we want to break apart. We want to subvert them. So yes, on the one hand, they may be dealing with social norms, but they're done in such a way that the society recognizes that the joke can only work if those people are still held down, if they remain silent, they remain not even complicit, far from it. They remain silent and disenfranchised and disempowered. So if the joke is about that, and that's passed off as a social norm, no, that's wrong. Because we're at a point now in 2021 where when we recognize a social norm, we shouldn't go, hey, right, many thumbs up. No, the opposite. The opposite should be what we're thinking of. So the difference between jokes about lawyers, rich folks, white folks, and disenfranchised minorities and people of color is a difference between power, wealth, privilege, entitlement, and all these things that these other groups do not have. So whether or not the joke or the jokester, right, because we're speaking about language as well as speaking subjects, intentionally or not, right, those racist and ethnic jokes reinforce that inferior position that many of those individuals who are the butt of the joke find themselves in. So the joke isn't helping at anything at all. It isn't breaking open anything. If anything, it's punching down, not punching up. Because when you punch up, right, you're punching back and you're pushing back and you're trying to break something at the same time. So humor that deals with racism, unless it is designed to call attention to it and dismantle it, then you've got a problem with the content of the humor. Now, this is the clip that I still think is relevant. Bill Maher, the week prior to Ice Cube showing up, had dropped the N-word. Not cool. And I'm not even going to say the N-word, but he did. And he got called out by Ice Cube. And Ice Cube was cool enough to make it a teachable moment. And so all of a sudden, Ice Cube explains to us exactly why even just a single word, it's depending on who's saying it, can mean something very different. So racist and ethnic jokes reinforce those weaker socioeconomic positions that visible minorities and people of color find themselves in. So this is a clip. It runs about 6-7 minutes, but it's a good one because Bill Maher finally pipes down and learns his lesson and realizes, sometimes thinking on your feet may get you in a lot of trouble, and that's what he's claiming to do. But Ice Cube rises above it and makes it a teachable moment. So have a look at that, and I'll see you back in a moment. Now, in this particular case, we're talking here about individuals. We'll call them speaking subjects, and there are listening subjects as well. Stand-up comedians are speaking subjects. We, the audience, are listening. But we're talking about words here. But words don't exist by themselves, do they? Right? They don't exist in a vacuum. There's no such thing as a pure language. Language is used by people. So some of the issues that arise around the use of the N-word is this particular one. The very groups that are victims of racist humor employ the same loaded terms in their own humor. So if you think back to what Ice Cube says, coming out of the mouth of a person of color, it's a tool. Coming out of the mouth of a white person, it's a weapon. Same word, right? The difference is the speaking subject, the person who is saying it. So although a minority group may use some of the racial slurs that others have used against them, they are using it quite often with a very significantly different meaning. The intent is different. And when we talk about speaking subjects, intentionality or intent is very, very important because it has a lot to do with kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, so why would that be? Why would it be that a word used by one person is harmful, but used by another could be educational, could be constructive? Okay, it's not a matter of self-hatred. It's not a matter of one group within the disenfranchised group trying to have it over another person. What matters is what I've been saying now for several months. It matters who is telling the joke, in what context, and for what reason. I cannot make it any clearer, because that is when you start finding issues with not the words themselves. We could say perhaps that, humor is amoral. Well, the N-word is a good example. Coming out of the mouth of one person, constructive. Out of the mouth of another, a weapon. So, if that is the case, depending on who is speaking, the joke or the term or the stereotype may be viewed positively rather than negatively. So the person that sits outside of the group, let's say we'll stick with the N-word, that is outside of the group, if you're going to use that word, you better be damn careful about it and be ready to get the repercussions. And so I cannot make it any clearer. It matters who is telling the joke, not necessarily what, because I've hopefully just proved a point that even a powerful word like I've just described can mean different things. But what matters is who is telling the joke. And in the context of stand-up or in the context of just talking to people, and for what reason. What was the intention of using that harmful word? Okay, having said that, we do know that a lot of humor is malicious. It's playing with the superiority theories that we've talked about. And nasty humor is quite often racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on. It plays with stereotypes. It's insensitive to the target of the joke, not the target audience, because the listening subject could be in on it. They could be feeling the same way. But what's happening is there's something that is about intentionality, right? The telling and sharing of jokes intended to harm or hurt is immoral. So here is the intention. For what reason? If you're telling a joke that is nasty for the sake of being nasty, that's not neutral, all right? That's not, beyond morality. No, that's immoral. It's unethical, immoral. And if you're a professional comedian, be ready for the pushback. Now, we also know that the use of language and stereotypes, even when it comes to the world outside of humor, many people have been knocked down and shut down for using, inappropriate language on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media you're on. The same thing is happening. There are some people that are trying to be really funny and, satirical or snide or whatever, but you can't write satirically unless you put it in brackets, to be read satirically, at which point it's kind of stupid. You cannot change the inflection of your voice or the accent on certain words when you're simply typing. So if you are dealing with these kinds of subjects, be wary, right? Be wary of what is going to happen to you. So in Carroll's book, he talks about this view of humor as an attitude endorsement theory. The idea that we're amused by these kinds of jokes because we ourselves are sexist, racist, homophobic, classist, anti-Semitic, any of these things, whatever the joke is dealing with, whatever it is trading in, that somehow we are not only understanding it and know what the joke is about, but we're also kind of endorsing it. So that's a pretty loaded position to take. So let's unpack this a little bit. Okay, attitude endorsement theory distinguishes the content, the malicious content of a joke from its wit, its wordplay, its kind of goofiness and absurdity, its incongruity. So what Carroll is saying is something that we need to clarify. So he says, okay, that attitude endorsement says that jokes are conditional. So depending on what is being discussed, the listener, right, the listening subject, needs to create their own background in order to make sense of the joke. In other words, what I talked about at the beginning of the slides, we need to be able to bring to the table the norms and expectations of proper behavior. Now, when the norms and expectations of a society are are racialized, right? Which is prejudice, racism and so on. That's when there's a problem. But when you have a joke that trades in this kind of cultural norm, that's, somehow because we've mistreated these people for X number of years, that's normal. We do it every day. We laugh at these people every day. Well, has anyone ever stopped to ask the people that are being made fun of how they feel about it? That's kind of what we're talking about. So if that is the case, we need to bring to the table our own understanding of the conditions that are being discussed in this joke, if they are racist or sexist or homophobic or anti-Semitic or whatever it may be. So we have to temporarily endorse, which is why it's called conditional. We temporarily adopt the emotions and the attitudes that the joke needs for it to work. We need to temporarily be racist or temporarily be sexist in order for us to understand the humorous content, the deviation from the norm. So, if we laugh at a joke that is, sort of inherently not funny, just because it's a dumb blonde joke, we just laugh at, because, it falls under the general category of dumb blonde jokes. Okay, well, what are those jokes anyway? I mean, really, is it an attack against every single blonde female? Or let's be maybe a little bit more specific. Is it perhaps against certain individuals who aren't too bright? It just so happens that this is the category of people that we've chosen. Society has decided that blondes seem to have more fun. I don't know if that's a statement you've ever heard or used to be much more popular. Blondes have more fun. And this was used in a lot of TV ads for Clairol products. And, all kinds of versions of platinum blonde and regular blonde and honey blonde and sandy blonde and everything else. Blondes have more fun. But the flip side of the same coin was that society also reserved the right to make fun of them. So that's kind of a really horrible place to be. On the one hand, society tells us that they have more fun. But does that set them up for ridicule? I don't know. That seems to be what society is saying, right? That seems to be the norm. So that's why even these norms need to be looked at carefully. So are we laughing at every single blonde female or just people who are, not so bright? Now, this is one that I present. Hopefully you can read it. Okay. After the game, he asked her how she liked it. Oh, I really liked it, she replied, because the tight pants and the big muscles, but I couldn't understand why they were killing each other over 25 cents. Dumbfounded, her boyfriend asked, what do you mean? She says, well, they flipped a coin, one team got it, and then for the rest of the game, they kept screaming, get the quarterback, get the quarterback. I'm like, hello, it's only 25 cents. Okay. Is it funny? Mildly. I like it because it's subtle. It's actually clever, because it's a play on words. It's not an attack on dumb blondes. It's an attack on somebody that heard quarterback, right? Because 25 cents is equals a quarter, so can't be that stupid. And was paying attention. She was watching the game. So how dumb is she? Like I say, it's one that I find is pretty mild. There's some dumb blonde jokes that are awful, and I will not trade in those. But I like this one because it's kind of cute. But I like the fact that she is listening, she's paying attention, and it was just kind of confused as to, why they want to get the quarterback. It's only 25 cents. But it's also a word play, right? And for that sense, or in that sense, it's kind of clever. Okay. Really dumb blonde jokes are nothing more than the moron jokes. That if you think back to our humor and ethics section of the module on that, the moron jokes and the canny jokes, and really that's kind of the same thing. And ultimately, it goes back to Hobbes' superiority theory, back to Plato's superiority theory, and it's really kind of what we're laughing at. The fact that, us versus them, us versus dumb blondes, allegedly. And really what we're laughing at is that momentary sense of triumph that, we would know better. And it's that we would know better that is the deviation. And again, it's mild. I mean, I showed you just a very mild dumb blonde joke because I don't like to trade in, nasty stuff. But it's still wordplay. It's still kind of clever in its own way. It's still made fun with sounds. Right? Quarterback, quarter space back. Okay, fine. So here we're laughing at a group of people that are not like us. And so in that sense, it is part of that superiority theory. It is true. Okay, now, April Ludgate, not a blonde, brunette, and a deadly funny one at that. So here I just want to talk about our ability to laugh at stupidity, regardless of the butt of the joke, may instead be an example of triumphant laughter. April is the queen of triumphant laughter because her put-downs and her comebacks are wicked. I find her very funny. Now, as an actress, that's her personality. Have you ever seen her? Obviously, her name is not April, but if you see her in talk shows, she has that same droll, deadly, goes right for what matters kind of comeback line. And I believe that April and I'm trying to avoid saying her name because I've forgotten it, sorry. But April Ludgate in Parks and Recreation is this really fun, kind of prickly yet adorable kind of character that seems to really revel in that triumphant laughter, and especially some of the comebacks. They are really good examples of exactly that. And no, she's not a dumb blonde, far from it, but it's just really able to think on her feet very, very well. That's as far as I'm going to go, but making fun of the other half, because I don't want to. So April Ludgate's best moments from Parks and Rec. See you back in just a moment. Okay, so the argument we had for attitude endorsement is that had to do with intentionality and the fact that we temporarily, assume the position of a racist or sexist or homophobic person in order to understand a joke. Now, the argument against it, which is much more important, is the content. And the content here, there has to be a distinction made between the form, the way in which the joke is presented, and the content, what it actually consists of. Now, I just showed you a dumb blonde joke, or I read one out to you. The form is, a dumb blonde joke, but there is in it a bunch of other kind of things. It's generally funny, clever wordplay, and the content, right? That's really the content of the joke. And so if we can make that distinction and say, well, on the surface, it appears to be a dumb blonde joke, but it's really about just, somebody who didn't quite get the nuances of the game. Now, I challenge anybody to watch, let's say a cricket game or soccer without knowledge of any of the rules. See how well you do, right? See how smart you sound when you don't have any idea what the rules are. Probably not very well. I mean, some games are loaded with rules. Cricket, to me, looks like a very complex game. It probably isn't, but I would sound pretty stupid if I were to try to make a call on what's going on, and I really wouldn't sound any smarter than the dumb blonde that we allegedly are not. So here, what I'm getting at is the fact that, again, the speaking subject, the listening subject, the form and the content of the joke have a lot to do in terms of how we can sort of separate these things out, that attitude endorsement. So what I mean is that there is always a possibility that a sexist or racist interpretation is in fact part of who the person is. The person listening may be inherently racist or inherently homophobic or sexist, and they actually misinterpreted the joke. Let's say somebody is inherently sexist, and I were to read to them the joke I just read to you about the dumb blonde. Well, to that person, it simply confirms what they already believe or what they think they know. So there, the joke really doesn't work in any other fashion than simply confirming what they already know. But there is always the possibility that the racist and sexist content could possibly be open for interpretation. Now, I wanted to blow up this image here because in certain cases, it really does matter. So, it was only a joke, which is, of course, what a lot of people say. It was just a joke. If the joke seems to fly over that person's head, that person is very unlikely to say, it was just a joke. Did you understand what I meant? It's usually when somebody pushes back, right? That's the instinctive reaction. It's just a joke. But if you are talking about sexist humor, right, you're talking about jokes, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, problematic language, the objectification of females, stereotypical, caricatures, all of that. And of course, what does that do? That reflects traditional gender roles, the glass ceiling, gender-based stereotypes that we're only just now beginning to break out of. And we no sooner doing that we're experiencing pushback as people move further and further to the right as they are terrified of this new world where there is more equality. And of course, it keeps moving up the ladder, up the pyramid, because these jokes reinforce traditional roles, which then reinforce harassment and verbal abuse, which, taken even further, go to rape and sexual assault and, physical and emotional abuse. Now, I'm not saying every single joke does that, but what I am saying is the context in which these jokes are traded and exchanged between the speaking subject and the listening subject start at the bottom. And so if we call these jokes out as being truly sexist, then at least we're trying to break the bottom of the pyramid. Notice it's at the bottom, because what do you do when you smash apart a foundation? Everything else comes crashing down. So if we can start with jokes and call them out, that's not a bad thing. And again, I'm not saying that we should censor everyone. People have a right to say things, but always stop and ask yourself, who is saying it, in what context, and for what reason? And if you can be comfortable with all three of those, then you're fine. So it is really difficult. I'm not saying that, censorship is an easy issue to deal with. It isn't. It's fraught with all kinds of difficulties, because often with censorship, we sometimes shut down the very people that need to be heard. So we need to be very careful with that. Okay, so Carroll's attitude endorsement theory is also kind of dealing with the fact that we are talking about people that don't really exist, right? These are fictitious representations, just like dumb blondes, right? The fictitious representation of certain individuals, the stereotypes, the caricatures. These are kind of fictional representations of who these people are. So if that's the case, whatever relationship we take, emotional or otherwise, to this content, right? These fictitious or fictional representations shouldn't always be considered, a viewpoint of real people. Because ultimately, if we're talking, again, dumb blonde jokes, we're talking more about people who are not very bright, not people who have a certain hair color. That's the part that matters. The general idea is stupidity. The particular way in which it's expressed is an allegedly, dumb blonde female. And yet we know in our human ethics module that there are all kinds of people who are unfortunately, hit with that particular stereotype. Every country has got a group of people that it makes fun of. In Canada, it's typically the Newfies. And you know what? And I've said it before, some of the best Newfie jokes I've heard are from other Newfies. They think they're hysterical. And they just embrace it and go, yeah, so what? And sometimes they'll turn around and they'll twist a Newfie joke, around to be somebody that reflects us. And then we all laugh. But Newfies in Canada are the people that we typically, have sort of fictional representations. And yet they're allowed to make fun of us. But that's an exception. But people that are consistently disenfranchised, consistently, downtrodden, disempowered, silenced, murdered, and not cared for just because of the color of their skin or the sex they were born into, that's not a reason to make fun of people. It isn't. So the content that we are trading in with jokes, we have to remember first of all that it's fictional. It's not a specific joke about a person. Yeah, there are jokes about Trump, lots of them. But for the most part, when we're talking about, let's say, a dumb blonde joke, it is a fictional representation. So this should help us to understand that when we were talking about these things, that we're not talking about actual individual people. So the content of this joke is open to interpretation, but where we start to get into a problem is that communal sense of malice, right? There are some people that don't see racism, right? Don't see sexism. And typically they are the people who are already in a position of privilege or entitlement. Because of their skin color, because of their class, because of their sex they were born into. These are the people that either know it and refuse to acknowledge it, or just don't see it. It's like asking the fish, how's the water? What water? Right? They don't see it. So here we're talking about the interpretation. It can be problematic if the person doesn't even realize that the joke is itself sexist or racist. There are some people that simply like telling a joke because it's nasty. They like to air these transgressive ideas because it makes other people uncomfortable. They don't seem to care. But when a stand-up comedian does that, yeah, they could be in a lot of trouble. Now, in terms of fictional characters, there are lots and lots of fictional characters that we have been watching for many years. Homer Simpson is still on. Al Bundy from Married to Children was on in the early, well, actually, let's say the mid-'80s to the early '90s. No longer around, although there's lots of YouTube stuff. And here, what we're laughing at, according to Carol, is a version of ourselves. And when you think about some of the other sort of comic theories that we've talked about, when we are laughing at, the inflexibility of ourselves. Now, whether it's Hobbes talking about the superiority theory, saying, it's kind of the way we view ourselves, and that aha moment is us catching ourselves doing something stupid. So we laugh at what we've just done and kind of hope not to do it again. The same kind of thing is happening with fictional characters. They are representations of ourselves, sometimes for humorous effect, not our greatest moment, not our finest moment, as Winston Churchill would say. So the laughter may not be necessarily pedagogical or educational or positive, but what we're laughing at is just we recognize ourselves, our laziness, sometimes, our willingness to sort of sit and watch TV all night. We're not endorsing the fact that people are lazy. We're laughing at it because we recognize ourselves partially in it. So in that sense, it has that educational purpose, even though, it's not something we want to aspire to. So in the end, comic amusement, right, as you probably at this point can realize, it's a complicated thing. It's made complicated by issues of censorship, issues of, linguistic freedom, the things that we can talk about. But what I'm hoping you're going to come away with is, on the one hand, there is or should be a degree of freedom to express, but there are limits. Even though we're talking about the limits of understanding, the limits here are when it borders onto clear and explicit racism, sexism, homophobia, and the rest of it. That's where the limits are. So humor at the limits of understanding, if it goes beyond that, then you know that you've crossed the line. So yes, it is complex. There's the form and the content of humor. There is the way in which the joke works. It can be on the surface, a dumb blonde joke, but it's actually about, a clever wordplay, or is just about people in general who are not so bright. It can be immoral, and yet funny at the same time. Now, it could also be completely repulsive. Probably you don't recognize who this person is right here, Helen Keller, who was an incredible person at the turn of the previous century. And now these days it's just the source of a lot of bad jokes. And I'm not going to repeat any of them. You can Google them if you like. They're not coming from me. But Helen Keller was, this remarkable individual who was born blind and deaf. If you could imagine that. I mean, such obstacles to overcome, and became an inspiration. But now she's an inspiration for bad jokes. So here we are, right? And so some jokes are just thoroughly repulsive. There's no redeeming content, right? You've heard that term, a redeeming content. There isn't any. But there are some jokes that maybe, the British call it cheeky. They're a bit cheeky, right? So clever wordplay, sort of a really sort of twist at the end that is clever beyond the immoral content. They are perhaps a bit more, as more of an exception, we'll say. But it depends on the response of the listener. So it matters who speaks, in what context, and for what reason. Because whatever the anticipated response of the listener will tell you why that individual said the joke in the first place. So moral transgression, jokes are sometimes simply unfunny, and the joke simply supports that position. And we try to say that, these jokes are immoral. Now, we've got to be careful, right? We have to be careful. Exactly what do we mean? What exactly is immoral about it? Is it advocating the death of people? Well, that's no longer a joke. That's called hate speech. That's called uttering threats, right? It's no longer a joke. So the ethicist, the person who considers certain jokes, immoral or unethical, they would be an ethicist. It becomes kind of difficult to point out exactly what what is bad in the joke, because, again, the example I'm going to use is, why is it that dead lawyer jokes are funny or funnier than dead baby jokes? There were dead baby jokes out for quite some time back in the 80s. I'm not sure why that kind of came and went. Again, look them up if you like. Some of them are genuinely funny because they're bordering on wordplay, and especially very clever wordplay. That's kind of when the joke sort of transcends its rather sordid, immoral sort of little cage and becomes something else. Because what we've done is we've separated the content of the joke from the form. The form of a dead baby joke is a clever wordplay. In and of itself, the clever wordplay is funny. But the the content, which is a dead baby joke, that's a little bit more immoral. That's a little bit more difficult. So, I just wanted to finish up our last clip here. Adventure Time, which is a show for, I'm not sure if it's for kids, because it has a lot of adult humor, and I don't mean adult as in risque, but it's a moment for adults, teenagers, young adults. I mean, I like Adventure Time. It was my son that pointed it out to me for the first time. We watched a whole bunch of them, and I find them very clever. A lot of fun. There's a lot of heart and soul in them, but it is very much a product of the postmodern times that we live in. It borders on absurd. It borders on a cartoon, first of all, that seems to not even defy the laws of gravity or logic or reason. All kinds of crazy things are going on. And it does play with expectations and incongruities for sure. And it does also draw attention to societal norms, cultural norms. In this particular clip, there is the beginnings of what could be very frightening. And then it kind of calms down and it's cute, then it becomes frightening again, and then it goes off in another direction. So it's almost schizophrenic in the way it presents humor. But all in all, My Home is Your Home is sort of a little 5-minute clip from an episode of Adventure Time, the cartoon series that I think was on, I forget, whatever, it doesn't matter. But Adventure Time, this is what I want you to end with. This is a really kind of new style of humor where there isn't kind of this degree of superiority. It deals more with absurdity and incongruity, especially a dog that speaks, and a rather clever dog as well. A dog that seems to be able to save the day and come up with, unique solutions. But have a look at that, and then we're going to come back and wrap up for our last slide. Okay, so what have we learned? We've learned that in this sensitive, politically correct climate, whether you want to call it cancel culture, you want to call it whatever else, it still matters, right? Who tells a joke, in what context, and for what reason. I'm sorry I've said it too many times. I'm probably going to haunt you to 3 o'clock in the morning. You're going to wake up with that voice in your head of me saying it. I apologize, but it's important. And it's the way in which we're able to make sense of the type of humor that we're experiencing today. The reason why I say that is because in the 1970s and 80s, things were a lot more lax. There seemed to be less worry about, offending someone. But that's not to say that people weren't offended. The difference was no one bothered to ask people of color or, black and brown people or Asians or, homosexuals and others, hey, how do you feel about this joke that really kind of belittles you and just, makes fun of you? Don't really like it. No one ever stopped to ask. Then all of a sudden, by the 90s, there was early 90s, there was the beginning of that pushback. And then with the invention of social media, that pushback that was already there was exponentially increased. So, comedians, I won't tell you to censor yourselves, but be aware that the listening subject does have the ability to speak. And that's what's changed. Is these jokes have always been around, they will always be around, but back in the 70s and 80s, and of course well before that, the people who were the butt of the joke tended to remain silent or did not have the means by which to push back. Now they do. So it does matter who speaks and for what reason. So humor, we know, has played with expectations, social norms, social expectations in terms of traditional values and so on. It also plays with incongruities, right? Those weird deviations. And it does so by always drawing attention to social and cultural norms. That's the only way humor can work. That's why surrealist humor, for example, is just more strange than it is funny. Because surrealism, if you know anything about it as an art form, it deals with surprise and unexpectedness. Now, surprise and unexpectedness cannot be a social norm. At the very least, it would be exhausting. So instead, what we have is a style of absurdist, juxtaposition of things. And you look at it and go, well, that's weird. An iron, right? Like an ironing board, an iron, with spikes on it. Well, it won't be very useful. And we kind of chuckle because it just is an all-encompassing thing. What we're talking about in humor is something quite different. It's not shock and unexpectedness and surprise. It is confirming social and cultural norms that we already have within us, we know about, and we see through humor its confirmation. But when those cultural norms extend to racism, sexism, homophobia, and the rest of these things, that's when the norms need to be called out for what they are. Because they're norms, or they are attitudes trying to pass themselves off as norms, trying to pass themselves off as tradition. And they're not. These are things that can be unlearned. So, humor is not beyond good and evil. A joke is evil when we are asked to consider its content as such. That's essentially it. So, I wanted to make this video early on Saturday because some of you contacted me about this material for your final essays, which are due tomorrow night. Will be April 11th. So looking forward to reading them. I've read a couple already that are very good. I'm really pleased overall with everyone's work. So this is the last content video. We're going to meet again on Monday. And then next week, I'm going to make one final video on the content of the exam. So in the meantime, have a wonderful Saturday. It's a beautiful day out there. Luckily, no one started mowing their lawn because my window's open and no one drowned me out. So I'm very happy about that. So take care and we'll see you soon.